So I'm going to say what mid-tier Big Ten performing teams in 2024, I'll define what that is, could step up big in 2025 to challenge for the conference title and maybe make the playoffs. So I'm calling mid-tier if last year you won anywhere from 6-3 in the Big Ten to 3-6, and then if at least your overall record was 5-7 or better. So I'm lumping in Michigan to this. There's 10 teams in the light green rows. Those are the mid-tier teams. In Michigan fans, I'm not calling you a mid-tier program. You just had a mid-tier year last year. I know you beat Ohio State, but you won 8-5. So I'm putting you in that mix.
In fairness, you have Iowa in there as well, and they went 8-4. So
yeah, that's right. That's right. And really, when I say make the playoffs, if you go 10-2 in the Big Ten, you've got a great chance to make the playoffs. If you go 9-3, it's potluck, as we kind of learned last year with the SEC teams. So, I didn't want to overthink this too much. Like I said, I mean, returning start, like I could have looked at things like returning starters, new additions to the portal. I think, later on in the offseason, we can look at those other factors. But I was looking at schedule difficulty, year of head coach, quarterback experience, those type of things that I went through earlier. So let me give you, and I'll walk through these teams, but I'm going to here's the ones I think who have the best shot to surprise and challenge for the conference in the playoffs. In this first team, I wasn't going to think I was going to put them on there until I actually looked at their schedule. But who has the number one easiest schedule, according to my criteria, in the Big Ten? And that is Michigan. Yep, Michigan is playing teams with a 27-54 record from the prior year. I mean, they're easily actually have the easiest schedule, if you will. Of course, they play Ohio State, but they avoid the other two, the big three. They only play one of the big three. They avoid Penn State and they avoid Oregon. Those two teams are loaded. Their other blue blood they're playing is USC, and USC, while has great potential, we all know last couple of years have been a struggle for them. They do have Oklahoma at Oklahoma as a non-conference game, right? So that's going to be a factor in, can they keep it to 2 losses or less? But we've been talking about Oklahoma earlier, right? In Venables, they basically were a 500 team last year. Do have a new quarterback. It's really an unknown how tough Oklahoma is going to be, but that game could dictate, a third loss for Michigan as far as making the playoffs for sure. And then the other thing why I put them as most likely to make the jump, though, in addition to that schedule, they're starting that Mikey Keene. I know they've got the 5-star recruit. I don't think he should be playing initially at first. Mikey Keene needs to be the starter, and only if Mikey Keene fails do they need to go to the 5-star. But 2 years at UCF, played quite a bit. 2-year starter at Fresno. They're the person they need. So they're not going to have a true first-year starter. And then, that Michigan defense, despite losing a ton, they still were quite talented. They did well against Alabama in that game. I do think Milroe missed a lot of throws, which has played a factor in that. But Michigan's going to be salty on defense, right? So I really, maybe based on that schedule, I'm putting Michigan number one. Number two, best shot to make a move is USC. So if you look at USC, their schedule, they have the 14th most difficult schedule, pretty easy schedule. Teams are combined 37-44 from last year. They do play Oregon and they do play Michigan, but Michigan is still an unknown, and they're not one of those big time juggernaut blue bloods. USC does play at Notre Dame, though, so I probably like USC's chances to battle and maybe get into the Big Ten championship game potentially. Notre Dame could serve as that third loss potentially for USC. But the other reason I'm putting them up there, JR, they had like four or five games I should know the figure where they were ahead in the fourth quarter, right, and ended up losing the game. They easily could have had a much better record than their 6-6 record. And then Jaden Maieva, very talented kid, only in his second year starting, but he's not a first year starter at least. So I put USC second. Third would be Nebraska. I'm putting Nebraska third. Again, they're tied with USC for a pretty easy schedule, 37-44 are the teams they face. Of the big three, they only face Penn State, right? So they don't have to play Ohio State or Oregon. Their non-conference game is home against Cincinnati, so manageable. I'd like to think they would get 3 wins out of conference. And then Raiola, mentioned it earlier, second year, that's when you make the big step, right? That's when you usually see the biggest leap. So I'm putting Nebraska third most likely to make the leap. Iowa,
can I say one thing really quick?
Yeah.
I probably would have had Nebraska number 1 if they held on to Tony White. If Tony White was still their defensive coordinator, I probably would have had them be number 1 this year. I still think they're in contention for number 1 of those mid-tier teams. But, losing Tony White, the addition of Dana Holgerson, as you've been stating, Dylan Raiola, possibly making the jump this year in his second year. But yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I wanted to point that out, that I think Nebraska had a chance if they hadn't lost Tony White to, possibly make a name for themselves to be that team to expect in the mid-tier to make the jump up.
Yeah, and to be frank, I put a ranking here just because it's good for people like to react to rankings, right? Yeah, you wouldn't have to pull my arm to adjust my rankings that much, right? I mean, it's a fine line between a lot of these teams, to be honest. So good point. I put as the next one Iowa. The leeriness there is they've got the second toughest schedule based on last year, right? The teams they play this year had a 47-34 conference record last year. So it includes Penn State and Oregon. That's a big reason for that, right? So they're playing 2 of the big 3, and then always a salty at Iowa State team, right? I mean, all bets are off in that game. So that could be the third loss that knocks them out of the playoff potential. But they've got the big, so this is the key. It's the Mark Gronowski. Let's face it, it comes down to that quarterback. South Dakota State, 4 years experience. I looked him up, JR. He's got oodles of experience. Yeah, it was North Dakota State, but remember, they're playing big playoff games, pressure games, right? I mean, he's an experienced dude, and that's what they need. I guess I could have looked at who in the hell he's going to throw to, right? I mean, like similar to Penn State.
Pretty much the same as receivers last year. They're, Reese Vanderzee, those guys. They'll have another year of development. Hopefully that'll be good for them.
Yeah, and then they really good coaching behind it, right? I mean, joke about Kirk Ferentz, but he's a good coach. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And then his defensive coordinator Parker, excellent as well. So number 5, so kind of in the middle of these 10, Washington, not a bad schedule, 38-43 of the teams from last year, so kind of middle of the road. On the downside, they play Ohio State and Oregon, so 2 of the big 3. They avoid Penn State. They play at Washington State though, so that should be one. I like to think that they could come 3-0 out of the non-conference, so that bodes well. A first-year starter, I know, is it Damon Williams, super talented. Damon Williams. That'd be the thing. That's why I wouldn't put him higher. In Washington, really, they had a tough schedule last year. I feel like they were a little better team than last year. The problem is their lines of scrimmage just weren't very good. When they faced a team with a really good defensive or offensive line, they just really struggled. I'm putting number 6, JR, Minnesota. Not a bad schedule there for the Gophers, 37-44 against teams. So, on the easier end of things, they are playing Ohio State and Oregon, though. So that's tough. Toughest non-conference is at California. California's quarterback, though, transferred to Indiana. So that's a good thing. But they're coached well. I know PJ Fleck takes a lot of flack. I don't love him, but I think he's a good coach. I really do.
Yeah,
in fact, I know he's a good coach. Yeah. But Max Brosmer, who went to my high school here in Atlanta, and I know Max. They're replacing him. Big thing to replace that. That's their biggest issue. I mean, they've got a bunch of question marks when it comes to really not experience. So that's going to be the challenge for them. And there's only so well you're going to do without that quarterback, experienced quarterback. So let's go the toughest road. So I'm going to jump to who I think is going to have the hardest time to make the leap from this mid-tier. I'm saying the Wisconsin Badgers, because I looked at their schedule. Yowza. I knew it was tough.
Not easy. It's not easy.
The teams they are facing in conference had a 51-30 record last year, the tops in the conference. They play Ohio State, Oregon, Michigan. Even worse, they're at Alabama. That's an L. I mean, that's just an L. It's a brutal schedule. The other challenge is their traditional rivals are tough teams. Iowa, Minnesota, we just talked about them, right? And throw Nebraska in there. So those three teams aren't easy. It's a tough thing. I'll come back to Luke Fickell in a second here in Wisconsin, but that I put them as the hardest thing. Rutgers, kind of the opposite. Rutgers had an easy schedule this year, not this year. This year I'm putting them, let's see, Rutgers, third toughest schedule, facing teams that were 46-35 last year. They play the big three. They play Oregon, Ohio State, Penn State. That's not good. That's probably 3 L's right there to open the year, from the get-go, if you know what I mean. Miami of Ohio as their non-conference is good. On the positive side, Cali Manis, third year starting quarterback. That's a good thing, right? So that would be the thing that gives them hope. They need to do well in those teams outside of the Blue Bloods that they're playing. Number 8 on the list, so third toughest to break through would be UCLA. They middle of the road schedule, but they do play Penn State and Ohio State. A road game against Utah. I know Utah had a down year last year, but maybe they bounce back. I did like the job that Deshaun Foster did, though. I think they have a good coach.
They had similar to a Wisconsin schedule last year with
brutal.
Everything
they
had going on. So
yeah,
just getting 5 wins last year was pretty impressive.
Yeah, and they did get a good transfer quarterback, or at least an experienced one. App State's Joey Aguilar. I think I pronounced that correctly. Yeah. So that's a good thing. Ethan Garber.
Got a wide receiver too, Caden Robinson, who was a huge option for him.
Yeah, as long as UCLA makes progress, right? They don't have to make the leap this year anyway. If they were to go 6-6, they're just fine. And then Michigan State. I don't know what to think of Michigan State. I kind of put them like 7th most likely to break through, which means on the low end, not a bad schedule there. 43-38. Okay, so they're playing teams over 500. So 7th toughest schedule. They're playing, Penn State, but they avoid Ohio State. They avoid Oregon. And then they have Boston College at home. I know they played them away. So reasonable schedule. The wild card is Aiden Childs. So he's in his second year. I mean, the guy was an interception machine last year, though. So, but in your second year starting, like Big Jeff says, you're supposed to make the leap. So I just have some questions about his leap, but he's really talented. JR, what do you think? What
got good guys on the outside
any glaring that you really disagree with heavily? Like,
no, not really. I do think that, like I said, Nebraska, better chance up there, but I want to see what their defensive coordinator does. Where'd you have USC again? Were they second for you?
Second best chance to make a breakthrough, actually.
Yeah, I might give a better chance to Iowa. Well, but Iowa has a really tough schedule, so yeah, that's the hard part. I think Iowa's going to be a better team than USC next year. Unfortunately for them, I'm not totally sold on their quarterback situation. I think Jaden Maieva did some really good things at UNLV, and he has the opportunity to, get much better. But I think USC's quarterback situation is going to kind of be boom or bust next year. And if Lincoln Riley does this year like he did last year, he could just throw Jaden Maieva under the bus, just like he did Miller Moss. So,
Yeah.
we'll see what happens there. I like Washington. I like Damon Williams, Jonah Coleman. I just don't know if I believe in that offensive line. After I
Your
took a
lines
look
were not good. Yeah.
at some of those numbers, and their defensive line I think is deep, but they really lack a true kind of star player on that defensive line. So a deep defensive line, which is good, but I just don't know how Washington's going to do on the line of scrimmage this year, especially away from home. They're going to have a good home record. Again, they're like the second longest home winning streak in college football, I think, right behind Georgia. But we'll see what happens. But yeah, no major disagreements from me.
One other one that I left out on USC that could be fine. Year 2 for D'Anton Lynn, who did a good job.
Yes.
Defenses under a second-year defensive coordinator can also make a bigger leap, and they made real good improvements. So that was another one I had listed I didn't mention.